Hey everybody, this is Mark with Beyond Profit, a global perspective, and today I want to talk about a SWOT analysis. I've done some videos where I've referred to SWOT analyses before, and it just struck me that some of you may not know what that is. In fact, it might be good to have that background before you go further with some of my other videos. And so I think it's a really good reference point. What it is an analytical tool that allows you to look at policies and figure out whether or not they're a good idea, right? It's analysis. Now, there's other ways to do it. I mean, the SWOT is not the be all end all, but it's a really simple way to approach it. What is it important for? I would say, first of all, for business analysis. Like if you're interested in business policy and whether or not something's going to be a good idea or a bad idea, definitely applicable in that situation. Second, I would say public policy. Same thing. If you're interested in government politics, whatever, you name it, it is a great tool for that purpose. And the third way that I frequently use it, particularly with my students, is in self-analysis. Yes, this tool actually can be used to assess your own prospects and think about how you might improve yourself. And so that'll be the third way that we discuss it. So let's go. So before we get started, I want to thank you all for joining me today. And of course, remind you that if you have questions or things you want to talk about, please leave them below in the comments. I mean, not all of these concepts that I talk about are super easy, although I think this one today is, pretty straightforward. But you might have some questions. Maybe there's some things that you don't understand. Feel free to leave those in the comments below. But I also might invite those of you that are practitioners. Maybe you're a political policy person or, business policy or whatever, and you have used these in different ways, tell us all about it. It might be really helpful for those of us who are still learning. The best way for me to describe what a SWOT analysis is would be to simply show you a picture of a SWOT analysis. So you'll notice that there are four big squares, four quadrants, and there are also labels at the top and on the side. And the idea is to whatever it is you're analyzing, you are looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you'll notice that there are labels on the side of this visual all along the four quadrants. There at the bottom, you'll see the word external origin, the attributes of the environment. So in other words, if you're looking at opportunities and threats, you're looking at things that come from outside of you, things that you can't usually control. Maybe you can to some extent, but they aren't things that are really within your domain. If you look at the next label above that, internal origin, that refers to strengths and weaknesses. Those are things that are about the specific organization or the policy itself, or if it's a personal SWOT, it might be about you, your personal strengths and weaknesses. Then if you look to the top, these are probably pretty obvious. Those elements of the SWOT that are helpful, that advance your cause, that advance the objective, those would be strengths and opportunities. And right next to that is the label harmful to achieving the objective, right? What are the weaknesses or what are the threats? So a SWOT analysis is a nice balanced way to assess a policy or in some cases, maybe even a person. Let me give you a couple of hypothetical examples of things like real policies and how we might assess them using a SWOT analysis. So let's start with a business policy scenario. In this scenario, we will assume that there's a multinational consumer electronics company that's implementing a China Plus One manufacturing policy. So let's say this global consumer electronics firm, they adopt this policy, which would shift 30 to 40% of its manufacturing from China to Vietnam and India to reduce geopolitical risk, tariffs, and supply chain concentration. This is not an unrealistic sort of scenario. This is a real world strategy that's being pursued by companies like Apple, Samsung, others, and reflects a political environment where there's a lot more tariffs, a lot more protectionism going on. So, how would I assess that policy? Let's look at strengths. It would reduce dependence on a single country for production. So, China, you take China out of there, you're not going to rely on them 100%. You take a significant percentage away from there, and that happens. It would improve supply chain resilience against geopolitical shocks. It enhances bargaining power with suppliers and governments. It signals risk awareness to investors and partners. Right? Those are all things that would be good about this plan. Some of the weaknesses, there's higher short-term costs, new factories, training, logistics. There would be a less mature supplier ecosystem outside China. In other words, if you are used to dealing with China over the long term, have been for quite some time, and you're trying to create new relationships, that can be challenging to deal with. Operational complexity from managing multiple countries, a lot easier when you're dealing with one country. It gets a lot more difficult when you go to many. And potential inconsistencies in quality and productivity. Because you're not having them sort of all in the same place, then you have to watch your quality operations. So those are both things that would be policy individual level features that are both positive and negative. In the opportunities category, that is sort of external things to the plan that you may take advantage of, that could be access to government incentives in Vietnam and India, faster access to growing Asian consumer markets, the ability to market the firm as more geopolitically resilient, and long-term cost advantages as the new hubs mature. Then threats could be things like political instability or regulatory shifts in host countries. Again, things you can't easily control. Regulatory trade or pressure from China, infrastructure bottlenecks, ports, energy, roads. This is particularly the case if you're going someplace where you're not quite as familiar with what the infrastructure looks like in that country, and you kind of have to get used to it. Or currency and labor market volatility. Let's go to a public policy example next. Well, in this case, our scenario is the EU implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What this would do would be to impose carbon-based tariffs on imports of steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity from countries with weaker climate regulations. So you're going to try to restrict access to your market from those countries where they aren't really they aren't hitting their climate targets. Their regulations are a little weaker. What would we do for a SWOT analysis here? Well, for strengths, it protects EU industries subject to strict environmental regulations. It reduces carbon leakage, that is, firms relocating to polluting regions. It positions the EU as a global climate policy leader and aligns trade policy with climate goals. So all good strengths. Weaknesses of the policy: high administrative and compliance complexity, difficult carbon accounting across global supply chains, higher prices for EU consumers and downstream industries, and the risk of uneven enforcement. If you're looking at opportunities, again, the positive things that are happening in the external environment, it incentivizes global firms to reduce emissions, encourages global convergence on carbon pricing, stimulates green innovation and clean technology investment, and creates leverage in international climate negotiations. Among the threats are these: trade retaliation from developing or exporting countries, challenges at the World Trade Organization, diplomatic tensions with key partners like China or India, and the risk of being perceived as green protectionism. Finally, let's look at an individual level SWOT. That is, using the same sort of an analytical tool to look at yourself. In this example, what I've done is created a fictional graduate student, the sort of person that I would teach, and used some of the traits of this fictional student to sort of like allow them to self-assess. And likewise, if you're in that boat, then that might be, you might approach this in the same way. Some strengths: the student is passionate about chosen field of study, has a strong academic record, effective communication and research skills, a supportive network of mentors and advisors. Weaknesses: perhaps limited professional experience in the industry, occasional difficulty managing stress, uncertainty about long-term career goals, a tendency to overcommit to projects and activities. Then, if we look at the external environment, some of the opportunities include things like internships and assistantships in the field, networking events and academic conferences, emerging research topics to explore, and the potential for interdisciplinary collaborations. But some of the threats that exist are things like a competitive job market, balancing studies and personal life, the financial pressures of graduate school, and changes in technology or industry demands. I will argue that this last use of a SWOT analysis is a really good use, not just to sort of like figure out who you are and what your future path is, but to also apply it to leadership studies. Like if you see yourself as an aspiring leader, you can look at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats within a given organization and look at your prospects for possibly being successful. So after looking at all three of these cases, what's the decision? What do we do? And the answer to that question is, I don't know, because everything's pretty well balanced. I mean, I would have to be that person self-assessing, or I'd actually have to be in the business environment and make good decisions, or the policy environment and try to figure that out. What's really nice about it, though, is it lays out all of the options, all of the variables, and sometimes it's more clear-cut than that, right? So maybe there's a lot of strengths and opportunities and not very many weaknesses and threats, and so it's very obvious. Or maybe it's the other way around, where there's lots of weaknesses and threats and not as very many strengths and opportunities, and you're like, dude, I'm not doing that. So I'm not telling you what the answer is, but I am just telling you this is a good way to analyze things. So I hope this helps you with your business, your policy, or even your personal decisions in your life, and I wish you all the best.